Welcome to Big Daddy's Storytime. We're reading a book, Inkheart, movie story book. Some storytellers can cast a spell over an audience using just words, but other people have an even more magical gift. Rosetta Flowchart was warm and cozy sitting in front of the fire, rocking her baby girl, Maggie. Her husband, Mo, sat next to her. He was holding a book from Grimm's fairy tales. "Let me read to her," he said. "Once upon a time there was a little girl. Her grandmother gave her a little hood of red satin. The little girl wore it all the time, and so she was called Little Red Riding Hood." Outside, unseen by anyone in the room, there was a flash. There was a flash of red. A red satin cape floated lazily down from the sky. Back outside, Rosetta reached for a baby bottle she had left on the windowsill, but it was gone. 7 years later. "You know, I have a book report due tomorrow, right?" the 12-year-old Maggie reminded her father, Mo. "This is the last one, I promise," he answered as he walked along a narrow cobble street towards the Alps Aqua bookshop. Mo traveled far and wide restoring old books. After her mother disappeared 9 years ago, Maggie always went with him. Carts piled high with books lined the shop entry. Mo's fingers ran over the spines as he scanned the titles one by one. "Maybe you'll find it here, Mo," said Maggie. The book you're always looking for." "What?" asked Mo, stopping abruptly. "I'm not looking for anything particular." "Yes, you are," Maggie interrupted. "What do you think? What? You don't think I've noticed? We never leave a bookstore until you've checked every corner, every shelf. You always come away disappointed." As Mo headed inside the shop, he gave her the usual warning. "Remember, no reading aloud." Megan nodded and rolled her eyes. She'd forget. She'd only heard her father warn of a warning 1,000 times. Inside, Mo headed into the maze of shelves. Each shelf was crammed with old books, just as he had done outside. Mo checked every title. He even lifted books, looking behind them as if he'd lost something, but there was nothing there. Then, as he ran his fingers across yet another row of books, a strange thing happened. A trail of whispering voices floated into the air. Mo didn't seem surprised. Books have always whispered to him. Suddenly, Mo stopped. He stood abruptly still. There was a new whisper, a woman's voice. He knew that voice. He headed in the direction of the voice. After years of searching, he had finally found it. Inkheart. Mo didn't know if he should leap for joy or burst into tears. Outside, Maggie settled onto a bench with a book and chocolate croissant. As she took a bite, she heard a chattering noise. Standing on its hind legs, only a few feet in front of her, was a small weasel-like creature. He was staring lonely at her food. Maggie tore off a bit of croissant and tossed it to the animal. He gobbled it up. Another piece followed, and another, and with each bite he edged closer and closer to Maggie. When he got near enough, Maggie reached out, to tickle the animal under his chin, he whipped around and bared his razor-sharp teeth and hissed loudly. Maggie gasped and jumped from the bench. "He doesn't like to be tickled," called out a man who was leaning against a nearby light post. "You should be careful. His name is Gwyn. He looked charming, but you know what they say about books and covers." "Oh, yeah, I do," Maggie replied, edging away. I always know I also know that what they say about talking to strangers. Excuse me." Just then Mo walked out of the bookstore. "Hello, Silver Tongue," the man said to Mo. "I was just having a little talk with your girl." "Maggie, go to the van," Mo said sternly, and then calmly he added, "It's okay, he's an old friend." Maggie started to argue, but Mo ordered her to go. Maggie froze, then turned and ran off. Mo had never spoken to her like that. I've been looking for you," Dust's finger began. Tell me what you want," sighed Mo. "The same thing you want. To undo the damage you did 9 years ago," answered Dust's finger. "And I've come to warn you. Capricorn knows where you're staying. His men are there now, and he wants you to read for him." "Well, he's out of luck," insisted Mo. "I won't do it. If I ever do it again, it'll be for one reason and one reason only." Dust Finger tried to grab the copy of Inkheart, but Mo broke free and raced back to the van. As they speeded away, Maggie grabbed her father's leather case. She had to know what Dust Finger wanted. "No, leave it alone," Mo yelled, snatching the case away and tossing it into the back seat. "You're not allowed to even touch that book." Mo refused to talk any more as he drove south towards Italy, where Mo's great aunt lived. Maggie's great aunt Eleanor lived in a mansion behind an iron gate made of spear heads. Eleanor seemed almost as friendly as that gate, but Mo told Maggie that she'd like Eleanor eventually. Maggie wasn't so sure. The next day, Maggie got up early. She wanted to explore the house. She went down a long hallway until she came to two tall doors. Pushing the doors open, she stepped into the most amazing room anywhere she had ever looked at there. Everywhere she looked, there were books, lots and lots of books. In the center of the room was a display case with a glass top. Maggie crept closer and pressed her nose to the glass. She could see what was inside of it. Step away from that case," a voice called. It was Eleanor. "What are you doing in here, child? This is not for children. Out! Out! If I promise not to touch anything, could I just sit and read in here for a while?" Maggie asked. For a long moment Eleanor stared at her. Then she turned and pulled something off a shelf. There's a window seat overlooking the garden," she finally said. That's where your mother would curl up." Eleanor handed Maggie a book. It was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. With a final warning not to touch anything, Eleanor swept out of the room. Maggie curled up in the window seat and carefully opened the book to the first page and began to read. The next night, Mo was working on Eleanor's collection of books while Maggie sat in the library and read. Thunder cracked and rain pelleted the windows. But Mo barely noticed. Suddenly, light filled his workshop. A fire was burning in the fireplace. Mo turned and found Dustfinger standing behind him. I tried to warn you, Dustfinger reminded him. I gave you every opportunity to do this the right way, but you refused, and all you had to do was read me back. You couldn't keep the book, but you could keep the book, but you ran off. I had to turn to Capricorn. He promised to help me. The sound of breaking glass from the library next door. Mo rushed in, but he was too late. Capricorn's men, led by Flatnose and Basta, were already tearing the library apart and burning every book in sight as they held Maggie and Eleanor captive. Then they forced the three prisoners into a waiting van and drove them to Capricorn's village. Capricorn had Maggie, Mo, and Eleanor locked in the stables. The other stalls were filled with strange creatures. Where did these monsters come from? Eleanor demanded. Books, Mo said. They were inside books. I have heard of others who could read them out, but I've never met one. Read them out? What do you mean? Asked Maggie. Maggie, began Mo, this is the story I've been waiting to hear, that you've been waiting to hear. We were house sitting for Eleanor, me, you, and your mother, Rosetta. We had brought a couple of books along, and one of them was Inkheart. It was a good read, adventure, magic, a mob of villagers, and the shadow, a creature so terrifying. I read several chapters out loud, and nothing happened. But then my voice brought Dustfinger and Capricorn out of the book. Your mother went in. Maggie started to cry. How do we know where she is? Or if she's even alive? She asked. Mo couldn't answer. All he could do was hug her. The next day, they were summoned to Capricorn's castle. The great hall was lit by thousands of candles. Black-jacketed men filled the room. Capricorn was sitting on a large throne. I won't read aloud, Mo protested Mo. Not with Maggie and Eleanor in the room. Capricorn ignored him. Here's how this is going to work. You do whatever I say, or I'll kill the old lady and lock your daughter in the dungeon. With that, he tossed Mo a book, 1001 Arabian Nights. It's a good one. Filled with riches, he said. Mo began to read. The hot sun and sand of the desert filled the air, and a magical waterfall of gold coins rained down. Stacks of riches flowed, and gems and pearls gathered in mountains around the room. Suddenly, a 15-year-old boy wearing a turban appeared, and one of Capricorn's men disappeared. Capricorn didn't seem to mind. He was only interested in the treasure. It's my turn, interrupted Dustfinger, like you promised. Your turn? Smirked Capricorn. He held up Mo's copy of Inkheart. Oh, you mean this? Capricorn glanced at the book once more, then smiled and tossed it into the fire. You promised you promised I'd be sent back, Dustfinger cried. Yes, I know, said Capricorn. I lied when I said that, and I'm a liar, And I lie all the time. Lie, lie, lie. All these years, you think he would have figured it out by now. Dustfinger dashed to the fire to retrieve the book, but all he did was burn his hands. Dustfinger retreated to the kitchen. One of the maidens tended to his burns. Dustfinger remembered when she was read out of Inkheart. The next morning, Dustfinger found one of the maiden's drawings. It was a picture of Mo and Maggie. Dustfinger realized that the maiden was Maggie's mother, Rosetta. She must have been read into the she must have been read into the story the same night he'd been read out. Later on, she'd been read out by one of Capricorn's lesser successful readers. Dustfinger promised to help her escape and find her family, but first he had to rescue Mo and Maggie. Mo had his plan. My voice was different than when I read. I was never so in control of it, he said. I know I can get Rosetta out of the book and maybe send Capricorn back in. We can't just have we just have to get another copy. I bet the author has a copy, said Maggie. Just then the door crinked open to reveal Dustfinger. Before you say anything, just know that I'm here to save your neck, he said. You want your wife back as much as I want to go home. Dustfinger tossed Mo a copy of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Mo knew what he had to do. He started reading. Then, when the tornado hit, trees and trunks and a roof flew through the air. The guards panicked and ran for cover. In the chaos, no one noticed as Dustfinger picked the lock and Mo led them all away through the forest. They had finally reached the nearby town, but Eleanor decided she had had enough. It was time to go home. I prefer a story that has a good sense to stay on the page where it belongs. Take care and good luck, she said, and left to catch a train, leaving Farad and Dustfinger at the town square. Mo and Maggie climbed up a hill to an apartment and rang the bell. They were greeted by an impatient elderly man in an apron. Fenochi, the author of Inkheart. Mo wasn't sure Fenochi was going to believe his story. He was right to be weary. It's a good story I've given you. I'll give you that, Fenochi said, silver tongue. Great concepts. I wish I'd thought of it, but it's too abstract to take seriously. I know your characters are so lifelike that they seem to jump off the page, but it's simply not possible. Mo and Maggie had no choice but to take Fanidio to see Dustfinger for himself. Exactly as I imagined him, cried Fanidio as he started to push his way through the crowd towards Dustfinger. Hey, where are you going? Yelled Mo. He doesn't want to meet you. But Fanigio wasn't listening. He pushed forward, startled. Dustfinger panicked and backed away. What is he afraid of? Asked Fanigio. Not of me, I hope. Of the end of the book, replied Mo. Because he dies, asked Fanigio. No, sighed Mo, because he doesn't want to know what happens. But Dustfinger had heard every word. "You think I care what you wrote?" Dustfinger shouted. "I am not a character, and you do not control my fate. If you did, I wouldn't have wound up here. I'm going back now. Now, how do you have a Now, do you have a copy of the book or not?" In his attic, Finigio tore open one dusty box after another. "The problem is, it has been out of print for decades. And then there was a fire in the warehouse. I did hold onto a few copies, but then I loaned them to a book exhibit, and they were stolen. I suppose Capricorn was behind the theft. Here we are." Finingio hadn't found a copy of the book, but he had found the original manuscript. Dustfinger grabbed the pages. "You'll do it, right? You'll read me back in?" He asked Mo. "I'll try, but it's not until I get my wife out," said Mo. "Well, then, we have a little problem," Dustfinger said quietly. "You can't read her out. She's not in the book anymore. She's in Capricorn's village." Mo was furious, but then he realized that while he might not need the book, but then he realized that while he might not need the book anymore, Dustfinger did. Dustfinger missed his family. He wanted to go home. Mo promised to read him back into Inkheart after they rescued Rosetta. Maggie wanted to go with her father, but he refused to take her. Angrily that she had been left behind, Maggie paced around her room. She stopped. She could hear voices whispering. She looked around. Peeking out of her bag was a copy of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. When she picked up the book and opened it, she heard a witch's loud crackle. She decided to try reading aloud. After a few minutes, a little black dog appeared out of nowhere. Maggie had read Toto out of the storybook. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It was Finingio, but he wasn't alone. He had brought Capricorn's men with him. They wanted to know where Mo was, but Maggie wouldn't tell them. Then Toto rushed out from under the bed and began to bark. Finingio saw the dog. He saw the book. He couldn't help it. She has her father's gift," he bursted out. Basta smiled slowly. "Another silver tongue. Capricorn will be pleased," he said. Maggie was going to Capricorn's village just as she'd wanted, but now she was going against her will. Meanwhile, Dustfinger had realized that he and Mo weren't alone in the car. Fared had snuck into the trunk before they left. They couldn't turn back now, so they let him come with them. As they neared the village, Mo hid the car in the bushes. Then the three slipped into the village on foot. Farad led the way up a drain pipe and onto the roof of the maids' quarters. While Mo searched for Rosetta, Dustfinger and Farid stood watch. But Farid made a noise and was overheard. The guards surrounded Dustfinger and captured him, but they didn't get Farid. That when Mo returned, Farid was terrified. "They're going to kill Dustfinger," he cried. Flatnose couldn't help but smile as Maggie moved towards the castle. I wonder what Capricorn will make you read, he said to Maggie. I hope it's something good. I'm excited. Aren't you? Maggie was far from excited. She was tired and fed up with Flatnose, with all of Capricorn's men, and the entire adventure. She just wanted to go home with her mother and Mo. At first, Felingio was excited to go to the castle and to meet the characters he had created, but after a while and some rough words from Cockler, even he began to wonder if his adventure was such a good idea, if this adventure was such a good idea. Inside the castle, Capricorn made Maggie read from a large stack of books before he was convinced. Now he wanted her to read The Shadow out of Inkheart. Maggie protested. You can't bring it out of the book. You can't bring it out of the book. You burned the last copy. I saw you do it. But Capricorn had one more copy that he kept under lock and key. It was guarded by poisonous snakes. However, Maggie refused to read. Let me show you what happens to those who disobey me around here, Capricorn said. He led Maggie outside and pointed up. High above them, dangled in a net, was Rosetta. As soon as Maggie saw her mother, she ran to her. It's you! It's you! Don't worry, Mother. Mo is here, too, somewhere. Well, that's good fortune, cried Capricorn, realizing who Rosetta was. Let me look at you. Ah, yes, I see the resemblance. Do you still think I can't convince you to read for me? Maggie had no choice. She had to read now. But Felingio had a plan. He was going to rewrite the end of Inkheart. Felingio stayed up all night scribbling away, but he was too late, as a servant named Mortala took Maggie away. But Felingio could take her away before Felingio could give her the page. However, just as Maggie began to read, Felingio crumbled up his story and threw it to Toto. The little dog carried the paper to Maggie, slipped it into a book. As Maggie read, the shadow began to form and follow her commands. But then Mortella spotted the crumbled paper laying in the book. She snatched it away before Maggie could finish. Just as Capricorn was about to order the shadow to attack Rosetta, Mo appeared. Keep reading, he yelled. I can't. There's nothing left to read, Maggie cried. Then write, he said, throwing her a pen. And that's what she did. She wrote the words on her arm and her legs, reading aloud as she went. The shadow reached for him with an ashy hand, and as it did, Capricorn began to crackle and fade like the old pages of a book, growing transparent and thin as paper. Capricorn's ink-black soul filled with terror as he saw the end was near. And so, too, did all the souls of all those within the shadows gaze who had committed villanousity in Capricorn's name. And they all blew away like ash in the wind, while the terrible monster itself disappeared and was no more. The shadow and Capricorn were history. Maggie's story wasn't quite finished. The old creator finally got his wish, disappearing into the world he had dreamed of. She wrote as Fandingio shimmered and disappeared. Finally, after what was almost a lifetime of wishing, the young girl's most heartfelt dream came true. As the mother she always knew she'd see again, and the father she cherished came running to embrace their only daughter, Maggie, dropped the pen. Her story was done as Capricorn's castle burned into flames and crumbled to the ground. Maggie hugged her parents. Dustfinger watched the happy scene. Now he could never go home, but Farid had a surprise for him. He stole a copy of Inkheart. Just then Mo walked up to them. He held out his hand for the book. He began to read. It had been many years since Dustfinger had set his eyes on the wheat field and the old windmill, but it was even more beautiful. Dustfinger vanished. Mo closed the book and smiled. Maggie approached Farid. "You can stay with us," she said, and the four of them turned and began to walk home. Thank you for listening, and come back again to Big Daddy's Story Time. Be blessed. Bye bye.